So today, I'd like to first thanks ACEDS for giving us the opportunity to present here, and thank you all for attending. Uh, so welcome, good afternoon, everybody. Today's webinar is titled Social Media Investigations and Analysis. I'm Michael D'Angelo. With me here today is Tara Alport, Allison Smith from our business intelligence team. We put together this webinar to discuss the impact of social media investigations, how they operate, what we can learn, how these investigations are constantly changing, um, and constantly changing with the ever-evolving landscape in social media and tech at large, as we're all well aware of. We have about an hour together, so we have a good amount of content to get through. We'll be moving sort of quickly. I'll be talking a lot as I usually do. So any questions, please hold for the end. If you'd like to see the material, I think this is being recorded, so it'll be posted to the ACEDS website. But any other content or material that you're looking for, obviously feel free to reach out to myself, Tara, Allison, or we have Tony Vines on the call as well from our control risk team. Any content that we don't make it to today, I'll gladly share with any of you. Whoever would like to see it, please reach out to us and we'll make sure to make ourselves available to share anything else with you. Now, for some of you, this might feel exhaustive, but this is certainly not all of the information that we can talk about when it comes to social media investigations, forensics investigations, or intelligence gathering. So again, if there's anything that I miss, or if you'd like to discuss anything further, feel free to reach out to us at the conclusion of today's webinar. For today's agenda, I'll be introducing today's overall topic as well as introductions to who we are. We're going to be taking a look at how social media can play a role in investigations, as well as the most common techniques we use to collect, uncover relevant information from social media sources, and how this information is useful to us. We'll also discuss how reviewing and collecting information from social media can help build additional leads for investigations. And we'll look at a real-world example of how this comes to fruition. We'll then talk about potential issues that are emerging with social media data in the online landscape, barriers that we face, roadblocks that can pop up. And as we all know, technology is evolving very quickly. So this definitely holds true for social media sites and platforms as well. We'll wrap up this session with some time for questions and comments as well. But to get started, we'll introduce our team and the topic, why we're qualified to speak on this topic. So social media investigations in general, why is this so important? It's important because about 93% of all internet users have at least one social media account. A large portion of that have multiple social media accounts or have access to them. The social media can provide a wealth of information and help answer specific questions, but looking at social media profiles can tell you where a person lives, where they might be traveling to, what activities they're involved in, potentially what their opinions are, and who they're connected to. Social media investigations can also find the person behind online communications often, and it helps us build out links and relationships. Why should you care about this topic? Well, social media investigations can be used in all sorts of contexts, including detecting fraud, potential threats, harassment, organized crime, potential violence, and similar investigations. It's also important for large companies to monitor online sentiment about their products, business, executives, and officers. Who should be hearing this or attending this? Really anyone who's in a position to deal with data requests, e-discovery, forensic analysis, those in charge of security or protection of relevant to companies, insurance agents who investigate fraud, general counsel and HR groups who manage employment disputes, and anyone who may have an interest in understanding individuals' personal connections, sentiments, ideas, where they may not otherwise be exhibited in a place of work or other situations. So to start, I'll introduce myself. My name is Michael D'Angelo. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a principal here at Control Risks. I've been working in the digital forensics world for about 15 years now. I started my career with the Department of Defense, leading forensics teams and investigations. I then went to the Manhattan DA's office, where I sat as lead investigator for cybercrime unit, specifically focused on major economic crime. And I've been working with many of the mid-size and large consulting firms for maybe the past 8 years or so across a broad range of engagements and investigations. I testify regularly on issues related to digital forensics and analysis, inclusive of social media and online investigations. And I also teach as a professor at several universities here in New York City. I'm a self-confessed nerd, and I just really love technology overall. But I really love learning more about technology, the way that we can access data, break things, and ultimately get at working towards solution for creating timelines or stories about what may have happened with a piece of technology. My studies focused on criminal justice and law, as well as digital forensics technology and the management of technology. With that, I'll pass it to my teammates, Tara and Allison, to introduce themselves as well.
Good morning, everybody. Apologies about that. My name is Tara Allport. I am a director in the Control Risks Business Intelligence Unit. I sit in New York and in our business intelligence group in North America, which covers both the US and Canada. As my counterpart, Allison Smith, and I will talk about really kind of the remit of what we do here at Control Risks as it pertains to social media investigations is we kind of do the public record, open source generalist research. So if you have a subject that you are looking at, whether it be an individual, even a company, whether it's you're going to invest in them, whether they are harassing you online, we are the team that will look into that individual or that subject, and we will collect public information on them in order to help our clients sort of make their risk-based decisions. My background is I'm an attorney. I interned at the Brooklyn DA's office as well as the Pennsylvania Innocence Project. So I was somewhat agnostic about which side of criminal law I wanted to work on, but I knew I wanted to work from criminal law. But from law school, I stumbled into a firm called Strauss Friedberg, which is where I grew up, and was known really actually for its e-discovery practice, which is why I referenced the name certainly on here. But I worked in their investigations group for almost 8 very happy years. And a lot of sort of my expertise in social media research came from the time I spent there when I was working out in LA, and we had a lot of entertainment industry clients. And this was about a decade ago, where the social media landscape was a little bit different than it is now, and we'll certainly touch upon that. But some of the actions kind of remain true in terms of like the anonymous poster, which again, we will also talk about as well. I've been doing this for about over a decade. I've worked at other investigative firms and ultimately got my PI license, which my husband thinks is much cooler than the whole lawyer thing. And, you know, continue to do this type of work here at Control Risks. And I'll pass it over to Allison.
Hi, everyone. My name is Allison. I am an associate director on the business intelligence team. So I work with Tara on our due diligence, our risk assessments, our social media investigations. I currently am based in Texas, although sitting in New York City at the moment. I began my career in foreign policy research in Washington, D.C., and I've been in the online investigations space for the past several years. I specialize in all sorts of different online investigations, including, of course, social media investigations, person of interest investigations, due diligence, and threat and vulnerability assessments. So really kind of across the realm of security and privacy work. I have certifications in cyber online investigations, as well as threat, vulnerability, and risk assessments, and also have my PI license, but in Texas. So really excited to be here today speaking to all of you about the importance of social media investigations and really how we do them.
Great. Thank you both. So to get started, we're going to first look at social media's roles in investigations, how it's relevant, and the different applications of how we're looking at social media.
All right, back to me. So we're going to take a little bit of time to go over the importance of social media investigations, really what a social media investigation is and what it entails, how to do the initial research and information gathering, and how to identify the social media profiles. So as Mike kicked us off by stating social media is really a critical piece of our modern investigations because so many of us use social media to connect, to communicate, and to acquire information. That is why the social media investigations can give us so much information because all of us are really using these profiles to send information essentially to one another. So, what do these investigations entail? Kind of two main points for these investigations. We want to be able to identify a person behind online communications, and we want to be able to gather information that will provide insights and further leads. So, as far as identifying the people behind online communications, we want to know their real name and want to be able to learn more about them. So, as a jumping off point, we'll use things like usernames, email addresses, and phone numbers, and sometimes even hints in their online communications. As far as gathering information about them, we are interested in where they are, what they're doing, what they're talking about. Certainly interested in any risk relevant information. So, are they using any language that's concerning? And are they talking about any particular targets? Social media investigations, looking at these profiles, also help us understand the activities and intentions of an individual. So, that can provide us further information as we're thinking about strategies of how we deal with this individual. Some examples of cases where social media has been really critical include due diligence, online threat monitoring, and then cases of harassment and fraud and all sorts of different things. And just to kind of give us some tangible examples of what this could look like, we dealt with a harassment case whereby an individual created persona accounts or accounts that obscured their identity, didn't use their real name and real identifiers in order to disparage the CEO of a major company online. And this individual actually went so far as to contact the CEO's children on social media. So for various reasons, of course, the CEO was very concerned about this. Since we didn't have a real name, we were able to use the email address attached to the online accounts that we knew about in order to find this woman's real name, where she was, and find her real social media profiles, which then helped us get a cease and desist order for those disparaging remarks online and the various communications. In another example, this one dealing with online threat monitoring, we did a project with a client who was concerned about the behaviors of a certain employee whom they wanted to let go. But they were worried about how that employee might react to being let go, particularly because this employee had been displaying concerning behaviors at work and had been targeting one colleague in particular. So we did a social media investigation and found that this employee had been posting violent rhetoric on their social media profiles, as well as specifically naming this colleague. So that information helped the client really form their HR and security strategy when they were dealing with letting this person go and then securing all of their people in their places once this employee was no longer an employee with the company. So now that we've discussed kind of the importance and some examples, what is a social media investigation exactly? It's a very broad sort of term. So we like to think of a social media investigation as the collection, analysis, and capture of publicly available information on social media profiles. So we're using the information that individuals post online to understand who they are, where they are, what they're doing, what they're talking about, and certainly who they're associated with, and any kind of threatening information. Common objectives in these social media investigations include finding missing persons, creating profiles of concerning individuals, and even providing evidence for litigation. Depending on, if it's a civil case or a criminal case, where we can find information about that individual, whether it's biographical information or whether it's information that they're posting about their activities and opinions online. For initial research and information gathering, first, investigators need to ask the question, what information do we have? And then you ask, what information do we want? And go about getting that information. So, for example, we might know a person's name and general location, but we really would like to dig into lifestyle, financial issues, and their professional and personal network. Perhaps we only have a username, and then we have to start with finding the person's real name and use that information to then build a whole profile of this individual. As far as how we find social media profiles, because of course people don't always use their real names, they might use nicknames, they might use totally different names, all sorts of ways to kind of protect and obscure their profiles. There are lots of different techniques that we'll dig into throughout this presentation, but the kind of key starting points that we love to have are a person's real name and location, and that really sets us off on the right foot as investigators. All right. And this is just a little infographic to help us visualize this a little bit. You'll see under OSINT techniques, the sources or the data points that we use to get started. So as I mentioned, things like real name, username, email address, etc. And then as we move towards the right in this infographic, we can see all the information that we can get out of those identifiers. So finding out more about the person, whether that's basic information like age and location, or information about a company or a network, all the way towards getting the real profile or the narrative of this person or organization, for their relatives, their economic situation, all their litigation, all their social media posts, all of that. So you can really start with a little bit and end up with a lot by using these investigative techniques that we'll discuss.
Yeah, and I'd like to add a piece to this graphic here. We see kind of in the middle there under the analysis portion where we broke this out into personal information, organizational information, and network information. You can oftentimes be left with one or the other. You might have one portion of this or bits and pieces from one and not the other. The digital forensics portion is dealing primarily with network information. We want to know the technical information behind the social media accounts, potentially from websites, multimedia files, graphics, documents that we can pull from whatever we find on social media accounts. And then there's also technical information behind the scenes that we can access generally through subpoena or some sort of legal requirement that will also help us unmask the locations or personal identifiable information about people behind these potential profiles or schemes. We'll talk more about that as we move on through this presentation. So to move on, we're going to start to discuss some of those techniques that Allison was alluding to, how we use those, how we apply them to different sources, and ultimately what we can get back and how that can help us. Allison, do you want to take this first part?
Bastante grande precisamente en nuestro tema. Doctora Carmen, muchísimas gracias por enriquecernos en esta mañana.
Sounds like we have some unmuted microphones there.
Culturales con la idea para nosotros. Agradecemos también a todos nuestros clientes que
So, this slide, and kind of just to circle back a little bit to Allison's point from earlier, as investigators, whether, we're collecting public information or more kind of the more the hidden information through different tools and digital forensics methodologies, social media is somewhat distinct in the fact that it is sort of a person's personal record that they are voluntarily putting out there. And, I'm going to make the caveat that, we certainly are very well aware of sort of this evolving landscape, disinformation campaigns, the use of AI and deep fakes. But if we kind of get back to which is sort of a separate subset a little bit, but if we're getting back to kind of looking at a subject, they are, by intents and purposes, choosing to put out certain information on themselves, which really kind of can give us maybe some insight into them, into their motivations, which may be sort of contributing to the investigation that we're looking into within that scope. And that's somewhat unique in terms of when we're looking at an individual or conducting an investigation, when we rely on public information, it's going to be what's in the public record, right? So it's not always sort of from the person's own or the individual's own perspective or mouth, it's maybe somewhat, editorialized. So social media, that's sort of on the macro, kind of giving us a glimpse into how a person particularly is thinking. So, the landscape, again, we will touch upon this. It has changed kind of quite a bit in terms of what information is now much more restricted, just in terms of the information that you can glean from metadata. But I would say that still some of the techniques are still pretty tried and true. The first thing that we will start with is if we have a username. Oftentimes a person will use the same username across different platforms. That might change now quite a bit, but that would be something that we would try. So if it's a particularly distinctive username on X, for example, we might look to see if they're using something like that on Twitter, or sorry, on Instagram. Or if, we can look at a URL in Facebook and maybe see that same username. We also leverage different OSINT tools and proprietary tools that might be able to kind of have plugged into the API to some of these platforms that can run then a username on the back end. Really is sort of much more efficient for our methodology as opposed to having to kind of scroll through. And also if there are email addresses or phone numbers that are tied to a specific account, there are some OSINT tools and proprietary tools that we might use to see if they can link up. It's always, trust but verify to a certain extent. It's not always foolproof when you're on the internet and kind of identifying these artifacts. It is a little bit the wild, wild west, but, we try and piece these pieces together in order to kind of understand the factual story. We will also, so from where Allison and I sit, we will look at the public facing profile of an individual or of a subject, sometimes it's a company or a nonprofit. And we'll look at what they post and sort of what their posts on the face can tell us, but then also what they can kind of tell us if we read some of the nuance. So my favorite, very kind of like almost analog, kind of thing to do is first thing, if we're looking at a person and we don't know anything about them, would be to look to see if anyone's wished them happy birthday. I don't know what it is. People can't stop wishing other people happy birthday on social media profiles. And the beauty of that is that at the very least, it can start to give us a little bit of an identifier of when a person may have been born. And that is sort of something that we will kind of hone in on. Other things that we will also do, and again, with the caveat that it's a changing landscape, but, looking at photos that they posted, oftentimes when we are doing investigations involving like asset traces, right? And we're trying to identify sort of a little bit of a pattern of life. We'll look to see, is this person taking a lot of sort of very extravagant vacations? What we kind of glean from that. If we don't know, and actually this happened in a case that we had a couple of weeks ago, if we don't know where a person is located, we might be able to look at a photo that maybe they've posted with something to be like, I love living in this unnamed place. And we might be able to search it across the web and actually find a similar location. One of our analyst did that, looking at literally like the horizon with the moon in the background, and was able to backtrack and figure out sort of an approximate.
Transparencia y rendición de cuentas en el manejo de fondos públicos.
Oh, I think we have a little background noise. If everyone could just mute, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Again, another thing that we will do is we'll look at domain records. If there is a profile, for example, in the URL that we might be able to backtrack to. I think less so maybe nowadays, but every so often we get lucky and we might find an archived social media page. Again, it doesn't happen a lot, but using tools such as the Wayback Machine, and we might be able to find some digital artifacts from there behind a social media profile. Same thing with looking at when I say source code, I'm talking about like the front end, like HTML source code. We can look to see if there's maybe an email address or a hidden username. That has actually helped me solve a case in the past, looking at HTML source code to identify those identifiers. And then the last thing, and certainly this list is not exhaustive, this is sort of like the tricks of the trade that we turn to first, would be, looking at what people are saying. Like, what are their conversations? What are their comments? What are they following if that's public information? Who is following them? Who are they friends with? When we look at social media, we have an opportunity to identify a person's sort of network that they're willing to publicize and put out there. And we want to be able to kind of learn from that, everything that we can as is relevant to our investigation.
Thanks, Tara. I'll add a little bit more here from a digital forensics standpoint. Chain of custody has always been important in digital forensic investigations and investigations in general. With social media really pulling anything from an online platform, maintaining a chain of custody it can be a bit difficult, especially with the introductions of consumer abilities to edit posts, delete posts, make certain sections private, other sections public. So maintaining the chain of custody is definitely an important technique that we use here. If data does change over time, we try to account for that during our analysis. So comparing different captures, different points in time, kind of creating a timeline of how edits evolve or posts or sentiments evolve from a particular profile over time. That dovetails really right into how we preserve this. So we have many different tools that can preserve social media sites. We do that there are several different ways. We can, we're probably all aware of the conventional flat collection where we're basically printing out PDFs of websites, the way that they look. But we have some more advanced tools that we'll discuss in a second. Tools like FAWS, X1, Snagit. These are tools that are going to actually be pulling out embedded items, give us access to some of the source code that Tara was alluding to. It'll also pull out embedded items that we can then analyze themselves. So the photographs, the documents that might be posted, the videos that are posted, we can then observe metadata, pull that out and analyze it as if we had sometimes the original source. Another method that we undertake, but is becoming increasingly more difficult to use, is the creation of dummy accounts. The idea, quite similar to the idea of catfishing, we're setting up fake accounts to set up a connection to either a target or somebody in the immediate vicinity of that particular target. We friend them, or we friend somebody within their relationship realm, and then once we have particular access, we can then start to monitor their behaviors. We can monitor interactions. Sometimes it's rare, but sometimes you can actually interact with the target and start to learn more information directly from that source. Additional methods and techniques. So one of the primary uses that we get of social media is running reverse image searches. So we can pull sources from what we think might be fake accounts and then try to figure out where the original source came from. Where are the original accounts, and can we verify that this is in fact an original or a dupe? This helps us create leads, helps us find additional social media accounts by running profile pictures, photographs, posts, or memes that are being shared. And running memes through reverse image searches might not seem like a relevant type of technique, but oftentimes it is, especially if we're looking for the original source of where a campaign or a specific thought pattern may have originated from. Additionally, like I was just saying, the graphic here on the right, what most of us are probably familiar with the term metadata. It's essentially the data about data or embedded within documents. Photographs and videos have a substantial amount of metadata, so much so that they have their own fancy name called EXIF data. EXIF data is what we usually expect to find with metadata, so modified access created times. But in addition to those standard fields, we oftentimes can also pull out locational information. We can pull out those geo coordinates. We can pull out make, model, serial numbers of the original devices that the photographs or videos were taken on. Those are really good first steps to give us a lead in determining who might be the source behind a particular multimedia file. Even more advanced, sometimes it'll include things like, was a flash used? So we might be able to determine the time of day in which this photo was taken if timestamps are not available. Can also help us with distance from the target. So if we have something in focus, oftentimes EXIF data will show us how far away the camera was from that target. I think Tara had said this earlier. We using photographs, we sometimes try to map where a particular target is somewhere in the world. All of these little bits of information can help us understand exactly where that person may have been at that point in time. So next we'll talk about additional leads, how these social media investigations and online content can help us draw additional leads and ultimately provide additional sources where we can then go look and gather additional information.
So when we're looking at leads and generating leads, there's not really a one size fits all. And I would say that actually nowadays that's even sort of more relevant, because now we're dealing with different platforms as well. Not a number of years ago, actually in fairly recent history, you would have sort of a social media platform that you could log on to, and it was not decentralized. And now we deal with sort of more decentralized apps, sort of shifting generations who might be leaning towards sort of one platform versus the other. So that's why we have to sort of, when we get sort of a client coming to us with a social media investigation or an investigation where there is a component, we really have to take a step back and kind of think about, okay, well, what is going to be our ultimate approach to this one? Because it could vary quite a bit. So, as Allison mentioned earlier, we will say, what information do we start with, or do we have to start with? If we have an individual's name and, we kind of know everything about them, and we're trying to understand, have they posted anything online, which could, ultimately impact the client or maybe the client's decision to do work with them. Well, then we're looking to see if we can identify all social media profiles identified with that subject. And we will do that through just sort of our online research, maybe using their name. We'll do that by running their email address, even their phone number, through different tools to see if we can identify different sites. We'll also do some on-platform research to see if we can find anything that might be linked to them. We'll look at family members to see if we can backtrack in. There are various ways now, and I think it has exceedingly gotten easier to create, more anonymized profiles, but we really kind of take all of the tools in our toolbox to make sure that we can identify all of the content that we can that is associated with the particular subject. That's if we have information. We might not always have that information. And, when I worked in LA, we oftentimes would get just a username, of someone who was maybe stalking some celebrity, and posting, rather scary things online about them. And it would be our job to understand, okay, well, who might be behind this particular username? And that's where we have to really rely much more on sort of the online, what I'll call the online archaeology or the internet archaeology, to kind of pull out artifacts that might ultimately lead us back to a person. So what I had mentioned before about the happy birthday, that actually holds true, right? If we have a username that we don't know who the person or persons or organization behind it is, but we do have the potential for a date of birth, that's a starting point for us. We can work with that. We can then start to dig out other pieces of information that we might be able to then backtrack into a profile. So it would be collecting these identifiers, taking a username and seeing if we see that reflected on other social media profiles, and then leveraging the tools that we have in our toolbox to identify connections. We have this bullet point here to say, preservation and patience is key. And I just want to touch upon quickly a case a number of years ago using X1, the power of X1 in preservation, where we had a social media investigation, and for months we were an individual was being harassed by an online individual. We were able to find out who the individual was, but we didn't understand why they were harassing our client. Our client, there was no connection. But we had a suspicion that this online harasser may have been paid off by a vendor who had worked with the client and who was sort of in this messy contract sort of dispute with the client. So we decided that what we would do, and a lot of the harassment was over was Twitter, then called Twitter. So what we decided we would do is we would just keep preserving this Twitter profile of this online harasser, and we did it for about 2 months. And one day, and this person would tweet different things. Really, what we were hoping for is that maybe at some point they would give us some information to kind of solidify this link that we thought might be there as to sort of their motivation for why they were harassing our client. And lo and behold, one morning, of course, it's always in the morning, I was driving in LA, which it takes you about an hour to get anywhere if you're familiar with LA, and get a call from my boss who said that this Twitter harasser had been tweeting all about how she had been paid off by this vendor to harass our client, but that she was tweeting and then deleting the tweets. But because we had it preserved in X1 and X1 was just collecting this information, even though in real time this online person was deleting things, we were able to have that record preserved. If the client wanted to go into litigation then with the vendor, they were able to do that. And it really is just sort of the power of, patience, but we were able to get there.
Thanks, Tara. I'm going to add here. So Tara had mentioned a tool X1. That is a powerful social media tool that we use in forensics as well. We use several others. Some of you might be familiar with ONA. ONA is another kind of archiving tool that does ongoing monitoring, archiving, capturing. Generally, tools like this can be used at scale. So they have a bunch of different API connectors that we can connect to different sources. As we start to learn more about people, uncover additional profiles, we can kind of build it all into one ongoing collection. There's also open source tools that have similar capabilities. Another one that we like to use, a tool called Watch It. Watch It allows us to actually manage and monitor specific changes to sites. So maybe not necessarily the individual tweets or posts, but it changes that occur to their particular profile. So if a picture changes, if their name changes, maybe if a comment on a post is edited or updated, we can set up automatic notifiers that tell us that there is a change that has occurred, and we can capture and preserve it. So a bit different, but ultimately the goal here is kind of the same. In addition to that, we also like to use visualization tools. Visualization tools are very helpful in building out relationships, especially as we learn more about a particular target and their kind of web of associations or relationships. If we put those into a tool like Tableau, where we can start to build out webs, we might start to uncover relationships that we maybe weren't aware of just by looking at it at face value. It also gives us the ability to start pulling in associated information like emails, mobile devices, document information that we pulled out of document metadata. We could pull out names, company names, email addresses, and then start to build out further relationships. Building out that web, visualizing it, helps us really understand the interconnectedness of multiple different players in an investigation. So to move on, we'll now take a look at a real world example of a case that our control risk forensics team worked with the business intelligence team here. So in this particular instance, we had a client that was concerned about disparaging information and remarks posted online. This involved a custom-built website that was entirely devoted to disparaging this particular individual. Social media sites and profiles that were being used, again, to disseminate disparaging information, comment, share information, share personal photos, as well as communications that were both email and physical mail. So the particular target as well as neighbors were receiving threatening letters, threatening emails. There was allegations of remote access to email accounts and social media accounts as well. The way that the website and Facebook accounts that were disseminating this information were established, they did so in a way that obscured the owner's original identity. So right off the bat, we were faced with a challenging task of trying to attempt to uncover who was behind all of these different sources. Additionally, an individual in the scheme reached out to the client's local town board of ed and sent letters to the client's wife and neighbors, as well as the children's schools. Individual claimed to move to the client's neighborhood, said that they were concerned about living near a criminal based on public records, as well as intimate knowledge of our client's background. Details about the target's previous arrests were posted online, and also seemingly included firsthand accounts of events from potentially a witness standpoint. Additional details about the target's personal life seem to have been pulled from the target's personal emails, as well as his wife's mailbox. So this didn't just focus on social media. That was a portion of our investigation, but we knew that there was potentially other online sources as well. The idea here is that we were looking holistically about how to approach this and use all of these different sources to kind of help walk towards uncovering the perpetrators behind this. So the way that we planned this investigation, we first wanted to determine the origination of the web page itself, if possible. We researched hosting information, purchasing information of the URL. We looked at how the actual background content was being hosted. And we found web addresses that were purchased from a Portuguese site, backend content that was being hosted on a virtualization server in Poland, and a WordPress site that was being hosted out of Germany. So all offshore sources makes it much more difficult, also added the level of complexity to our investigation. Once we learned this information, though, we automatically knew that this was a sophisticated target of our investigation. And as we started to uncover and peel back this information, our sophisticated targets began to transfer hosting to Bulgaria, started to move around the virtualization companies. So it now became a moving target. The good and bad of that is obviously, number one, it's a moving target, difficult to learn more and more information about that particular person. But the good part of this is it gives us a lot more potential targets to exfiltrate relevant information from. But once we understood what we were dealing with, this sophisticated actor, we decided to set up monitoring systems on the website itself, as well as known social media profiles that were spreading these accusations. So we began to capture information from the website, social media accounts, and then continuous monitoring of those. We then moved to analyze the content and media found on the website. So we were looking for the origination of the photographs. We found the social media sites that were then sharing these photographs. We took note of source profiles, as well as associated Facebook profiles that were posting these images and sharing comments as well. We did so by running reverse image searches. We were able to find these Facebook profiles, as well as some associated accounts that we believed were relevant. Next, we pulled underlying code from the website itself to look at technical information about the site. So sometimes we can look for what we call calling cards of the creator. If there's known actors out there, they tend to do attacks or these types of campaigns in the similar fashion over and over again. This is how federal agencies attribute specific types of attacks to foreign groups or organized crime groups, because there's particular tactics and calling cards that they leave behind. When we're looking at things like custom built websites, we're going to analyze the code to see if we can pull out any of those potential calling cards. We also want to look at particular launch dates, when URLs are purchased, when they start going live, etc. This all helps us understand kind of the organization or the content behind what is being posted. The review of the code also helps us literally understand how an attacker or suspect is organizing data on their backend. And I'll show you an example of what I mean in a second. But based on our review of the underlying code, it was evident that the actor was used to this and did have experience in organizing content, publishing to sites, and then kind of creating these sharing social media campaigns. We also knew information from email communications were being used on the websites. So we analyzed suspicious email header information. We also audited login information for both the Gmail account and the social media accounts. This helped us understand where suspicious logins came from and suspicious devices that were being used to log into accounts. From many of these different sources, we were able to isolate multiple IP addresses as well as MAC addresses. MAC addresses are similar to a serial number. They are unique to a physical piece of equipment. So every laptop, phone, tablet have their own MAC addresses that are very difficult to spoof, not unlike an IP address, although IP addresses are much more easier to mask or hide. So we were able to basically start consolidating a list of IP addresses, known MAC addresses of devices. We also were gathering information about the hosting websites. We were able to gather some logins, and as well as obviously pulling information from the content that was being shared. We took all this information, we mapped it to try to determine where, if we could find a tight vicinity. And the totality of this data was used to make a formal presentation to state police, who began serving subpoenas to hosting companies, the virtualization, social media sites, WordPress, which is the website hoster that was being used. And all of this was being used in hopes of providing this to content providers and unmasking things like payment information, personal information, identifiable information, or address information. So here's some visuals of the underlying code, what we were looking at, as well as how we were running different types of checks on the hosting information, auditing logins for the social media and Gmail account. You can see here all the way on the left, we were able to find devices that were suspicious in nature, logging into both Facebook and Gmail accounts. We then also looked at these three kind of background graphics here. These are all underlying codes resources that we pulled from the website to show the organization of how this person was storing the multimedia files on their computer. We can see folder paths. We can see the way that they were naming these, so they were highly organized. This all, again, gives us information that this is a sophisticated person and not just somebody off of the street that threw together a website without any background knowledge. And then the last graphic there down on the bottom where you could see country of Bulgaria being highlighted, this is our record searches to show the website where it's hosted, underlying IP address, and the company that is hosting this information. Again, all of this is going to be used in conjunction to then start serving legal notices to the companies to uncover or unmask payment information and personal information about the people behind this. We were able to establish a series of IP addresses that tied back to physical addresses, both from the Gmail, Facebook, and some other sources that we got subpoena information back from. We plotted this information. We were able to, this isn't a full map, but we were able to basically hone in on a local Starbucks. We found the local Starbucks. We were able to figure out their ISP provider. We were able to serve the ISP provider with a subpoena to ultimately unmask user information about known usage. And of course, this with our other sources and culmination of multiple sources of information, plus the login information, plus the locational information that we gained from Facebook, helped us focus our investigation tremendously. Ultimately, all of this information was bundled up. It's currently making its way through the legal system with state police, and federal authorities have been involved as well. But this goes to show you that, starting with a singular website or a single social media platform, we're able to start pulling at threads, figuring out additional information about where content originated from, where it's being shared. We start to build out relationships. We start to figure out additional sources, and then ultimately we can go to those additional sources with legal backing to gain more and more information about individuals behind some of these campaigns. Sites that require proof of payment are getting better about keeping these records on file so that we can use them in legal proceedings. Social media sites, it's getting a bit tricky. We'll talk about that in a second with emerging issues. So to move on, as I just mentioned, with any piece of technology, there's always going to be issues. We're always going to face some sort of dead end or potential roadblocks. And these issues evolve over time. There's no one fix to any one of these issues, but these are things that we deal with, we take into account during our investigations, and we try to be as nimble as possible to get around those roadblocks.
So diving into these emerging issues with social media analysis, I think one of the primary issues that we've alluded to earlier is that individuals are increasingly using privacy settings on their profiles and encrypted messaging services, which means that there is no public information in that for investigators to gather. Not only are users enacting these sort of settings themselves, but social media platforms, due to concern for privacy rights as well as pressure from governments, have been making their platforms sort of more difficult to search, more difficult to find profiles, as well as more difficult to search content within the profiles. Some of that API that Tara was referencing earlier, some of these social media platforms are not allowing internet scrapers to get at their data. So if you were to, for example, use Google to run some keyword searches, you actually wouldn't be able to pull any information that's being posted on that social media site. Additionally, the kind of the dummy accounts that Mike was talking about, that individuals we're looking into use, certainly, but also we use as investigators to protect ourselves and our identities, are getting more difficult to set up because social media platforms are requiring you to use sort of multi-factor authentication, phone numbers, all these sorts of things to make sure that the user behind the profile is indeed a real person. So that poses challenges for both users of the profile and then investigators such as ourselves that are trying to mask our identities if the people that we're looking into are concerned about who is looking into them. Also regarding privacy, so ethically, investigators do want to be careful about the information that they're pulling from social media profiles. It is sort of a personal history, a personal record that people are posting online. And of course, if they're posting it publicly, then it is public. We can see it, we can collect it. However, just from an ethical and sort of moral standpoint, we want to be careful about digging into personal issues or mental health or things like that. So, that's just sort of an ethical guideline for investigators that we want to consider. Another issue that is increasingly challenging is misinformation online. So the growth of misinformation and artificially generated content can make it difficult for investigators to tell what's real from what's fake, whether that's published content or photos, all sorts of online content that might be actually misinformation. And there is no guaranteed way to spot misinformation kind of on the surface. So AI particularly makes it difficult. And the tools that have been developed to sort of detect AI are lagging behind the artificial content generation techniques themselves. So the methods of detection really haven't gotten up to speed, or they're at least not all the way there yet. So as investigators, we have to make sure that we're checking information across multiple sources and confirming as much as we can, and sort of doing that backtracking to see if the information is real versus fake. And sort of a funny example of AI generated content and trying to find out if it's real. A lot of you might remember the photo that was spreading online of the Pope wearing a big puffy white Balenciaga jacket that everybody thought was really fun because, like, how well dressed is the Pope? But that was actually, it went viral and people were really excited about it, but it turned out it was an artificially generated photo. The way that people started figuring it out was because certain issues in the photo, like his hand was enlarged, the cross on his neck was blurry, things like that. You can sort of get a few hints there. But that is to say that as investigators, we can't take things at face value because there is this AI generated content and misinformation spreading online.
Now I'll piggyback that. Allison had just touched on the difficulties with keeping pace with evolving technologies like AI content generation and tools that can find that or identify that. Same holds true with the digital forensics side of the house. Social media sites, we're probably all aware if you're a social media user, the layout, the user interface is constantly changing. Facebook, Twitter, they are constantly, making updates to their platforms. And this ultimately makes our job a lot more difficult because it breaks our tools often. The APIs change quite frequently. So the way that we can connect to these platforms sometimes run into roadblocks when there's a major release. And we also want to think about major changes that occur at large, things like the introduction of end-to-end encryption for Facebook and Instagram Messenger, site remodels from Twitter to X, additional messaging capabilities built into things like Snapchat. All of these things have a direct impact on the availability of data and the way that we collect that data in an efficient manner. Proper preservation and handling of data is very important. We want to verify that data has not changed and we can authenticate it against the original. But the major issue here is that pulling data from websites or social media sites can be very difficult sometimes. Oftentimes, as some of you may have seen, capturing web pages requires preserving a page in state, or basically a flat text-based document. It's a rudimentary and unsophisticated way of capturing a web page, but ultimately it's been considered the norm in years past. We now have additional tools that help us exfiltrate embedded items like images, documents, banners, and more, as well as the underlying web page code, which can help us further authenticate and verify data. It also gives us access to things like metadata that helps us dig a little bit deeper in our analysis. And then lastly, talking about reporting and documentation practices, it's always important that investigators keep notes and document where sources of information were found, the importance of particular information, and memorializing it with screenshots and or forensic captures. The reason behind this is because the data on social media accounts can be edited, it can be deleted, it can be marked as private, and those acts in and of themselves may be evidence of a cover-up or additional crime. So we want to be aware about how data is evolving on these social media platforms and online. We had all mentioned several tools, archiving tools like Watch It, Wayback Machine, and others. These can assist in archiving sites over long periods of time or specific dates of usage. This is helpful in showing patterns of changes over users' profiles or specific pages. And then we also want to be making references back to original sources. Web page titles change, profile pictures change, comments can be edited or updated. These are all things that we want to take care of and make sure that we're monitoring, not just taking them at first. Our first collection, we're taking as gospel. So these are all things that we have to account for and address while we're doing our analysis. With that, that concludes our content. We'll open up the floor for any questions or comments that you all may have. I see one here in the chat from Raj. If AI generated content is everywhere, will AI generated metadata be next? So Raj, I guess one of the roadblocks or difficulties that I didn't touch on in this prior slide is social media sites have become much better at scrubbing metadata when you upload content to their websites. It's not across the board. So not every social media site will scrub metadata, especially those sites that have some sort of messaging platform. Think of Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. Data that you send through those via direct message, metadata will not be scrubbed at large. Will AI be used to generate or manipulate this metadata is a question that I think, have yet to solve or see in the wild yet. I guess we'll figure that out when we get there. But metadata manipulation has been around for quite some time. One of the most notable tools to cover metadata is a tool called timestamp, which allows you to manipulate timestamps, which can throw off our timelines when we're doing timeline analysis. So the idea of metadata manipulation, this has been around for quite a while. Will AI be used to manipulate that in a way that makes it a little bit better? I assume so. I haven't seen it yet. So sorry, I can't answer that question as best I should, I guess. So, well, now we're getting a flood of questions in the chat. Being Is there an ethical issue with creating dummy accounts in interaction with the subject? Yes, there certainly are. Many law enforcement groups actually will not allow you to interact directly with the target of investigation, although creating dummy accounts to monitor or build out relationship lists is still a method that's in use, reaching out directly to targets of investigations in attempts to try to gather additional information, usually frowned upon, and there's usually ethical dilemmas that come into play there.
And Mike, let me just also kind of clarify. 1,000% agree with you. And when we say creating dummy accounts, number one, we're only collecting public information. So anyone could hop on, Facebook and see what is certainly being posted. When we do our research, we are not at all, interacting with the subject. If they have a public Facebook page, we will look at that, but we are not friending or liking or poking or, anything with that. And actually, that is one of the things that, just going back to the emerging issues, that we really need to be staying on top of is sort of what are the different nuances in the platforms that, even if a person is publicly posting something, that they might track. When we make a research account, is what we call it, it's just a way of, if we're looking at someone who maybe, is a dangerous individual or whatnot, if something accidentally happens, if I accidentally, trying to close the web page and like them, they might not necessarily be able to find out my full name, but there's no kind of interaction that goes on in terms of us with the subjects.
We got another similar question about legal concerns or limitations when conducting these types of investigations. I think I'll take a first pass at that, and then Tara and Allison, I'll pass to you. There's certainly legal limitations that we run into, right? I tried to touch on a few of those in our case study, where we can learn a lot about individuals, profiles, web pages, the providers behind those web pages. But at the end of the day, ultimately, most of that information can be masked. When you're making payments for services like hosting websites or a virtualization service, buying URLs, that type of information is usually held by the providers. Additionally, private information that's held by your internet service provider, that's all very useful information to us, but we don't have the legal authority to get at that information just through our consulting world. We will need some sort of legal backing, usually through a subpoena or some sort of court order, to unmask that information. So we certainly run into those types of limitations as well.
Yeah. And I think, from an investigative standpoint, as Allison mentioned earlier, because it's public information that's out there, we're not looking to collect anything that we're not that isn't public. But, I think that, we definitely take into account, sometimes for example, if we're looking into a subject and they happen to have, minor children, we are very, very sensitive to that and careful with maybe how we frame that information. We certainly wouldn't, even if they're posting photos, we're not going to include like a photo of their kid or anything like that, more on sort of like the ethical line. And that's just sort of, kind of how we approach it. And, also, to Allison's point, when we're looking at information people are putting out there, we're looking at it in a very sort of specific focus, right? So if I am going to, invest $100,000 with someone and I see online that they are, or, living this sort of crazy lifestyle, which doesn't really make sense, that's kind of what I'm looking for. I'm not maybe looking for, and not going to include other stuff that really isn't particularly relevant, for example. So, again, it's public information, but we definitely try and, just be sensitive and always on sort of the right ethical line when we do our investigations. Let's see. I think there were a couple.
We may have addressed most of them. Similar type questions.
Effective tool to scrape LinkedIn. Allison, did you have?
Sure, I can speak to that one a little bit. So unfortunately, there's no great answer to scrape LinkedIn. There's not a tool that can kind of give you the back end of LinkedIn as far as every person the individual is connected to, those sorts of things. So LinkedIn does require some manual research, and there are definitely limitations. So websites like Rocket Reach and things like that might aggregate public information on LinkedIn, such as a professional history or education. But finding connections in particular on LinkedIn is very difficult. There are some tools that can do it to a certain extent, depending on the settings that that person has put on their LinkedIn profile. But I will say that in our experience, we typically can't pull connections. And what we're getting from LinkedIn is really that public facing profile.
I'll also say that the continual scraping of any social media site will definitely put you on their radar. And so there are limitations that will prevent you in the future from doing ongoing scraping of data from things like LinkedIn, Facebook. We saw Facebook with the Britannica issue a few years ago. LinkedIn has similar issues where people run studies about connections and relationship building, and then essentially they get banned from scraping too much information from the platform. So there, I don't, as Allison was alluding to, I don't know if there's one singular tool that does a great job. It's really kind of try and use multiple tools to aggregate as much data as possible. With that, I think we've addressed all of the questions or close to it.
Yeah, no, this has been awesome presentation. A lot of very helpful information, I think. Exciting backgrounds, obviously deep in the weeds in this area. I threw in the chat for everybody the next event that's coming up that will include a team from Control Risk, and this will be enhancing support for litigation comprehensively through data analytics and e-discovery. That's going to be October 10th at 12 to 1:15. We will get out the information. I think Tony put her email in the chat here if you'd like to get a copy of the presentation. With that, I thank everybody for attending this afternoon, and thank you for our presenters. Really helpful information.
Thank you very much.